Hey guys, I'm gonna make a, as quick as I can, tutorial on long stitch books sewn into paper covers. If you hear screaming in the background, it's because I'm home with my kids. Good times. Here's a little perspective on my workspace. Not ideal here at the kitchen table, but this is what it looks like sometimes, you guys. This is what it looks like. All right, I tore down all of these papers. I tore this paper down to our normal size, our class's standard size, which is 5.5 by 4.25, and then fold them in half. And I folded them into signatures of 4 pages each. And then I put them in stacks of about 10 and pressed them overnight under a huge stack of books. So now I've really taken a lot of the bounce out of those papers. Pressing the folded signatures under weight is a hugely important step. Don't skip it. Leave it undernight under some books, which is why you always want to have some signatures kind of ready to go. Like this is a big batch. Make a big batch, press them. For some of these, I'll probably put under books and just leave them there for days and days and days. And then when I need them, they'll be nice and pressed. So yesterday I made a prototype of the book structure, the long stitch sewn into paper, and learned quite a bit. So I'm gonna show that to you now. I'm gonna give you a walking tour of the book that I made and all the things that are wrong with it. And I'm gonna make another one and fix all the things that I did wrong. Here is that book. I made this from pink cardstock. And here is the long stitch. I like this design, it's kind of fun. The biggest problem with this is that this flap, once I got the text block in, this flap is not, doesn't close properly. It doesn't connect well. This flap edge is not tall enough to wrap around this snug in a way that fits. That's the biggest mistake of this book. It's also too stiff. There's too many layers of paper here, and but other than that, it's okay. Oh, and there was too much bulk on the spine, and I cut some of the paper off, hoping that it wouldn't show, and it does show. So I've got this ugly kind of crack down the middle. So I don't like that. Don't love this book. So now I'm gonna show you how to do it right. As always, we fit the cover to the text block. So I've chosen 6 signatures because that is going to be the amount of signatures for the spine sewing pattern that I want. I have this piece of red cardstock that is textured on one side and smooth on the other. I want the textured side to be on the outside, so I'm gonna make all my marks on the inside. When I fit this cover, I'm going to exaggerate the square because I know that I'm going to end up trimming the cover once it is glued. So the structure here is to get the square around one signature. Again, I'm gonna exaggerate this and I'll trim it down to exactly where I want it to be. I'm gonna make it even just a little bigger. I'm gonna give myself plenty of space for trimming. That's how tall it is, and then an exact line on the back of the spine. Now I'm also going to end up squaring that line. And now I need to get the thickness of the spine. And to do that, I need to recognize the amount of bounce I have here in the text block. This is even after it being pressed. Going to line up the text block with that line I just made, and then make another line on the other side. I'm going to make it just a little bit loose. I don't want this to be too tight. Okay, I can even go back and like double check this and measure it. So this is just a little over 1 centimeter. So I'm gonna just double check this. This is 1.5 centimeters. And you know what, I feel pretty good about that. Just give myself a little bit of space there. And now this space will be doubled over here. So I'll take a piece of scratch paper and transfer this measurement over here. All right, now I'm going to take all of those measurements here, cover number 1, spine, and cover number 2, and transfer those measurements to the top and bottom, and then connect those lines. And then use my triangle to square this top line. But this isn't the whole structure because I'm going to have another width of the spine, basically. Width of the spine plus a little, and then the covering flap. And I want the flap, if this is the front cover, I want the flap to come just about halfway, a little less than halfway. This is 3 inches, here's halfway. So I'm gonna back up 1/4 inch from halfway to determine the the length of my flap. So here is my spine width. I'm going to put that measurement over here, but I'm going to add just a little bit because it's going to have to fold over, and that adds bulk. So this is maybe 1/16 of an inch. And then this measurement that I just took here, I'm gonna add that over here. And so that will be about right there, but actually I'm going to give myself some space to trim that just to make sure I can get it right. So I'm gonna add, you know, about 1/4 of an inch to give myself some wiggle room in trimming. Okay. Square up this line. And this line. All right. So here's a prototype of a cover. If I put in my text block, this is what that's going to look like, right? So I just made this from a cereal box. So that is the structure that I've made here, right? Cover, spine, cover, fold, flap. Now I'm going to score this line, cut this off, and fold this over so that this is 2 layers of cardstock. All right, now I want these lines to be on the front so that I know where to score this once it's glued down. So the next steps are to transfer these lines to the front very lightly, because I'm going to erase them after a while, and then glue these two pieces together. And then after it's dry, I'll go back and score the lines. A few tips on this gluing: make sure that you get glue all the way to the edges. Make sure these edges are very well laminated. And now that I have all this glue applied, I'm going to let this dry under a heavy book and let that sit until it's dry, probably about 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna switch it up here a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and make a second book. This book is going to have a different enclosure than the red one. Now, this was really fussy trying to work all of this out. So there were way too many steps to show, but here's the final result. This is the same shape of paper that I took from the red book. I just used the red book as a template. But this enclosure is going to be like this one. It's gonna have a magnet, a recessed magnet, and a magnet on the flap, and it will close like this. This is not sewn together, this is a prototype. But I don't want the magnet to be, I want the magnet to be recessed so that it's not so thick. What that means is that I'm cutting a window out of this. This is going to fold over. The magnet will be here. Then I have this paper cover that is going to be recessed down here to cover the magnet. But I'm also adding a piece of manila folder here on this window because this is the front cover. This is just gonna add a little bit of thickness and stability to that front cover. I'm also going to add a card, just a piece of manila folder, which you could also use cardstock, to the back cover to add a little bit more stability there. So the component end, I'm going to glue in a piece of book cloth to the spine. This is very, very important. You must reinforce the spine. It's going to be 2 layers of cardstock, but that's not enough thickness or stability for the sewing to be really safe and secure. So I cut this piece of book cloth that is going to be glued into this spine. So I'm going to glue this piece of book cloth to the spine to keep the sewing stations from tearing if they're pretty close, because this spine is pretty narrow, so my sewing stations will be fairly close unless I design them otherwise. So the components here are this added card for stability, this added book cloth, this added card, and then the magnet, which will go here, and the paper cover over the magnet, which will go on top. So now I'm going to glue all those things down. Now the next step is to let this dry under some weight, but also it's really important to wick away the moisture that has been introduced to this paper through the gluing process. So I have some scrap pieces of paper here. It's just scrap printer paper. I'm going to sandwich this in this paper and place it under some weight to dry. Okay, we're back to the red book. Now I do have a major regret, which is not pasting in a piece of book cloth between the spine. So I'm going to paste one on now because I really have to have that book cloth here to reinforce the spine. First, remember that I left some space to give myself some wiggle room to trim. So I really want to determine where the square is, how big this book is going to be so that I don't overlap this book cloth too much. So here's the square on this side, and I'm going to find the square on this side here. So I'm going to trim this bit off, and the book cloth really doesn't need to come up as high, so the book cloth only needs to be that wide. I'm going to measure the size of that and the width, and I want the book cloth to come right on the inside of these lines that I drew, because those are going to be folded and it will occupy some thickness, and I want them to sit right inside. All right, now this is dry. I'm going to score these folds. I'm also going to take away these pencil lines because I'm not going to score these until the very, very end when the pages are all sewn in, because I really want this flap to fit perfectly, and I won't know how to do that until it's all put together. So I'm gonna just double check and make sure that this is a good place to fold. And also, if it turns out that this is a little bit too baggy, which it might look like it is, I'm just gonna wait until the end to fit that. So I'll just go ahead and score this along the lines that I already have drawn. I'm going to make a hole punching guide for the spine, so I'm going to use this piece of cardstock to kind of mimic the spine in order to make this little sewing guide. So this is pretty straightforward. To make that more narrow. Okay, I made this sewing guide. I just kind of made this up as I went along. I spaced these lines out in a reasonable distance. I offset the sewing stations because if these were directly side by side each other, then the string would probably tear through. So I put them on an angle so that these holes wouldn't be so near each other. And you'll kind of see how that plays out as I go. So now I'm going to open up this spine, put this hole punching guide in a good and stable place. In fact, I'm just going to take some washi tape and tape it in place. I'm gonna put this piece of spare board, this is just a spare piece of cardboard, under here so as not to damage my mat too much, and pierce these holes according to my guide. Okay, I got a little bit off down here. So I think I'll move that hole over just a little bit. That is really not ideal, but I can try to kind of heal that hole I just made, maybe kind of cover it up a tad and scoot it over. Okay, now I'll go back through on the other side and punch these holes a little bit deeper. Okay, now I have to punch the holes in my signatures to match the holes that I have here. The way I do that is to be sure to keep the signatures all in the same order. And I'm just going to line them up. Make sure I know where the square is so I can line this up. I'm gonna erase that line in a minute. Line this up here and make a little mark on the spine. And then I'll open up this signature. Punch some holes where I made my mark. Be really careful not to make these too big. And I'll go through and do that with each signature. I'll determine the length of my thread by just counting. You know, there's 6 signatures. Here are the holes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a little bit of extra. Some bookmakers would tie a knot in the end of this string and go through the signature. I don't like to just have a knot inside a signature to hold the string in place. I think it's best practice to secure the string to itself. So for this book, because I want this line here and this line here to be a solid line, I'm going to need to come up through this signature first. Also get rid of this line down here. So that's where I'll start. I'll start by coming up through here and then down through here. So that attaches the first 2 signatures. Okay, we're getting to near the end of this. Now I'm going to trim off this square because my book is where it is always going to be. No changing it, no adjusting now. I'm going to cut off this square right here. Now we have to determine where to fold here. So to do that, I'm just going to take a straight edge and make sure that my spine is square here. I'm not pushing it forward like this or backward. I want it totally square. And then applying pressure here. Now I'm just gonna make a mark with the straight edge of this. And that shows me, that mark was a lot sloppier than I wanted it to be. Hopefully that can kind of rub off. Let me see if I can erase some of that. And use my butter knife to score. Now I can determine where this fold is going to be. I don't want to squish this down really hard, but I don't want it to be baggy either. So I'm just going to close this gently and make a mark. I'll transfer this mark to the top and the bottom. Line this up. And score. I'm going to cut this flap a little bit shorter here. I feel like that hangs over too far. So I'm measuring 1.25 inches. Now for the enclosure, I'm going to sew this button right here. I actually want a red button, but I don't have one. So I'm just going to put this on as a placeholder. And then I will make 2 puncture marks and attach a string that will wrap around. got this string, I've wound it a couple of times, poked a hole in the cover. Going to tie this string on. I'm going to try to make this as flat and not bulky as possible, but remember, I'm not pulling this too hard because I don't want it to pull straight through. Okay, now this will wrap around. Around that button. And that's finished.